my beloved research scholars and department members, guests from other guests who have come here to take part in the webinar. A warm welcome to all of you. So today is indeed a very auspicious day because it is the beginning of Navaratri, and it is the ideal day to start the second session of our webinar series, Engaging Theory. And this series is actually a continuation of our earlier lecture series where we engage uh, with issues like structuralism, theories like structuralism, post-structuralism, deconstruction, and also other topics like postmodernism. Now, this second series will be addressing post-colonialism, cultural materialism, and Dalit studies. It is indeed coincidental that on the first day of the Navaratri, when the second session begins, we have with us a lady who is an embodiment of Shakti, the female principle of strength. More than the religious connotation, the concept of Devi is in Indian mythology is a fascinating one uh, because because of she engages in a fight with the evil forces and finally emerges triumphant. So today, uh, today's resource person, Dr. Jyotimol P, who is a personal friend of mine, uh, embodies the innate strength of women, which made even Western writers like George Bernard Shaw to view women as an agent of life force. You know, in the famous play Saint John, the preface, he has dealt with it in detail. Those of you who have read through her academic achievements in her profile that was posted in our WhatsApp group must have been pretty impressed by it. But what has impressed me most uh, about my friend Dr. Jyoti Morty are two things. The way she constantly engages herself in all the current socio-political and economic issues around us through her innumerable writings in the social media as well as print media, which hold a mirror towards the society regarding the status of women and their problems and the problems faced them in the society. It is indeed fitting that today she is going to speak to us on post-colonialism, and the lecture entitled From Counter Discourse to Discourse, I'm sure will engage in several of these conflicting issues that we face today. I'm amazed at the way in which she manages to find time to do all these things. That is the second thing that I admire most about her. And on behalf of the department, my colleagues, and all those who are present here, I, I offer a warm welcome to you, ma'am. Welcome.
Respected Dr. Anjana Shankar, a very close friend of mine, and Dr. Sujeesh, Preeti, and Dr. Vinod Gobi, who are other people whom I know in the department. And let me also acknowledge the young enthusiasts ranging from Sridevi, Sneha, Srija, and others in the department whom I have come to know uh, through this kind of the digital media, and of course the team app. I know they are on the other side. And dear participants who have come today, and dear students, it is indeed a privilege for me to be invited for this engaging theory second session. And I think a theory in itself will not serve any purpose. Anjana Miss was just talking about why I write or write how I write. It's because we infest, or rather we live in two domains, one of theory and the other of practice. And as a teacher, as a woman, as a human being, I deem it my duty to bridge the gap between the world of theory and the world of practice. post-colonialism or feminism or whatever theory that we speak about, without its practical applications in an imperfect universe, there is no way that we can redeem the world. And so thank you for all the nice words and this great opportunity. I think it is a wonderful privilege for me to be speaking here. And I know, I mean, like, because of this, you are actually speaking to some empty space, but then I hope so many discourses can be addressed through empty space. And I hope that we will be able to find some kind of a meaning in things that we have. So what I have planned is, I don't know, like, what I have planned is a basic idea about what is post-colonialism, because a lot of students also probably is listening, and then major theorists who are associated with it, major ideas in post-colonialism and the themes, etc. And the trajectory of where have we reached now. So that's a kind of general idea that I have planned, and so I hope we will. I'll begin right now, ma'am. How long is the time? Like 1 hour, 1 hour, 15 minutes, or what?
So much you want, you can talk. No, we'll have a talk and then no, not like that. But we will have one and a less between 1.5. See, 1.5 hours, less than 1.5 hours, and then a brief discussion also. As you please, sir.
Yeah, that is good. Otherwise, it will be much like colonialism, the force I want to denounce. Okay.
Or 15 minutes or so, and then discussion.
Okay. Thank you. So with your permission, let me go into the topic of my discussion, which is counter discourse to discourse, the trajectory of post-colonialism. Now, what I want to argue is that post-colonialism began as a counter discourse, and probably it is as much culpable as a discourse now. That's the kind of point I want to reach. I don't know if I will. Now, this term counter discourse is actually suggested by Richard Turdiman, and he used this term to characterize the theory and practice of symbolic resistance. Later on, we have Ashcroft, Griffith, and Tiffin, those post-colonial theorists. They adopted this term in their key to post-colonial concepts, and they use this term to refer to the ways in which challenge to dominant or established discourse can be mounted from the periphery. So, post-colonialism as a movement that we understand today tried to challenge from the periphery a central movement, that is colonialism, a very invincible force at that. And now, so starting with that, let me just talk to you about, you already know these things, but I'm just trying to bring your attention to how and why this started. Actually, colonialism had sprouted roots in Renaissance, during the time of Renaissance, with a view of human beings to see what is on the other side of the world. The journeys for trade, for exploration, the age of conquest, we have seen all these things in our history classes. Though the term colony probably goes back to Roman conquest time, because it was a Roman term which actually meant a settlement of people who went from a foreign country to another country, from a different country. So you see the change that has come to the word colony. Colony was something where the foreigners settled when they went to a new land. It was an exclusive space which they occupied. Later on, the meaning changed, in which these foreigners remained as masters. The ones who came, they became the colonizers, became the masters, colonizing the natives and turning them into a colony. So that there is a huge name change, term change bringing in a lot of hegemonic, I would say, discursive changes in the whole universe. And the European nations, when they began their say their conquest, and you should also remember that early conquest, early Roman conquest, and we have seen a lot of conquest. It had nothing to do with imperialism or the colonialism that we speak about now, because it, as Taisha Abraham, most of these youngsters, the current PG students who have done Taisha Abraham's essay would remember how she mentions that it was pre-imperialist. Early conquests were pre-imperialist and hence not part of colonialism. It was just a settlement. People conquered a place, kind of occupied the space, took away whatever booties, whatever profits, not in the colonial imperial sense, but whatever wealth they had, and left it at that. But colonialism was far more far-reaching, I would say, and it had far more implication and impact because of its, I would say, the imperialist nature of colonialism. And it was the European nations' greed for profit, greed for wealth that led them to colonialism. So, where you go for trade, later on you establish your colony there, your settlement, later on you become such a master that you colonize, you turn into, you transform the entire nation into a colony. And, we have also seen how this European idea of European togetherness and their difference, it is the difference from the natives that marks this idea of whites and the others, uh, the concept of the other. And 18th and 19th centuries actually saw the emergence of colonialism as a force, as a destructive force, which is led by imperialistic ideas, imperialistic themes, imperialistic drive. And imperialism was more an idea, and colonialism was a practice actually. And of course, imperialism was connected to corruption, inequality, and racism. There is this idea of the European nations, European individuals, difference from the native, and how they were different in their color, nationality, language, manners, civilization, and how they are an entirely different lot, and how the Europeans are different. And this is all led by the imperialist tendencies. And imperialism actually is an economic and political domination, especially a kind of influence through remote control. Because even when colonialism leaves, imperialism remains. That is why we can never say that we are post-imperialist. We can never say that we are post-imperialist because the unseen thread of imperialism is always there. Our memories, I would say, are fractured with the implications of colonialism. So colonialism is the practical impact of imperialistic strategies. Imperialism is of profit making, of corruption, of inequality, racism. These are all there interwoven with this idea of imperialism. And imperialism is not. Imperialism and its practical side of colonialism is not just a control of Asia, Africa, or America. Actually, it is an organized destruction of native culture. So this is how it differs from earlier conquest to later colonialism. So there is an organized the destruction of native culture, perceiving the difference between the colonizer and the colonized. You suddenly perceive that, okay, they are different. I am somehow more privileged than them. And now, when you are privileged, what should you do? You should try to make them, you suddenly have this implication, this idea that you are somebody better, somebody more endowed, and it is up to me to civilize the other. And we are all aware of the civilizing mission. We have all heard about the white man's burden and the necessary steps undertaken by Macaulay. It is in 18th, 19th centuries that imperialism perceives the difference between, started perceiving the difference between colonialism, colonial nations, colonial masters, and the whites, Europeans, and the others. And I think, and another interesting thing that we can notice, Europeans are able to perceive the difference between Europe and the other thing, but they consider the others as one monologous entity. You know, there is no pluralism in them. You, me and you are the other, one block. It is a homogeneous other. That is how the difference that operated between Europeans and the natives never apply to native, the micro level of native life. That is one anomaly that you would perceive in a lot of anomalies in imperialism. So we're moving from from a trade relation, from say some religious a trade relation with a lot of religion of coming of Christianity, which came back early, and there were a lot of Western cultural import through trade, through colony, through cultural import. We are moving into establishing a total sway over a new place, and slowly the erasure of the native culture. And Pradeep Nayar actually talks about 3 levels of colonial encounters. You know, first is the physical conquest, or rather coming and settling in a place, colonizing them, and starting their settlements and living there. Second is we have the European scholars. They try to review the native literature through their idea of the Orient, and they try to review the native literature. And what do they try to do? They try to perceive that, okay, something is lacking in say this in the native culture. And so it is up to us, up to Europeans to make up for what is at loss. So primarily, European encounters, 3 levels of European encounter: settlement by Europeans, appraisal by European scholars about native literature, and then finding it lacking, trying to better it through the intervention of European scholarship. And then transformation of in native societies, the slow transformation in native societies through missionary work, European education system, European bureaucracy, and of course the introduction of English language. And I'm sure we all know how Macaulay has spoken about what is the intention of introducing say English education in the colonies, to establish, to bring up a group of interpreters. And English was put forth as the language of advancement, and civilization and native tongues were pushed behind. Because modernity was thought to be connected with learning English and learning Western. So naturally, racial encounters emphasized the European theories of supremacy and denigrated the native races. So the politics of color, the politics of nationality, everything had fallen into the right places. Now let me just read a little from, we have all heard about the white man's burden. The white man's burden is, we associate the term to Rudyard Kipling. He has given us very beautiful, hunter tales, beautiful, tales of the jungle life, etc. But I have something. There is this hunter. It is seeing this poem that made me feel how wrong my reading of Kipling was. Kipling has written a poem which is titled "The White Man's Burden: The United States and the Philippine Islands." So this is a poem actually, "The White Man's Burden." In this poem, Kipling urged the US to take up the burden of empire as had Britain and other European nations done earlier. So this poem was written in 1899, and it was published in February in a Mercury's magazine, And the poem coincided with the beginning of Philippine-American War. So naturally, Theodore Roosevelt, who was to be the later president of vice president and then president of America, you know what he did? He copied the poem sent to his friend, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, commenting that this was rather poor poetry, but a good sense from the expansion point of view. It is interesting to read The White Man's Burden. We have only, most of us, I think we have only heard the title, The White Man's Burden. It is actually the title of the poem, and I will read some lines of the poem for you. Take up the white man's burden. So if I read the poem, you would understand why post-colonialism is necessary. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best you breed. Go send your sons to exile to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild. Your new caught sullen people, see? Your new caught sullen people, half devil and half child. We have seen a half devil and half child in The Tempest, isn't it? Half devil and half child. Take up the white man's burden in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride. By open speech and simple and 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain, take up the white man's burden and reap his old reward. The blame of those you better, the hate of those you guard, the cry of force you humor, oh, slowly to the light. So take up the white man's burden. Have done with childish days, the lightly proffered laurel, the easy, ungrudged praise. Come now to search your manhood. So that is the idea of, I would say, the white man's burden. So those people who are half devil, who are sullen people, you go conquer them. You civilize them. It is up to us to civilize them. So now we would, and we have slowly the decolonization starting. So colonialism is ongoing, and slowly through revolts, through national independence movement, we have decolonization happening. And as Fanon would say, decolonization itself was a very violent process. And now that brings us to the term that under spotlight, post-colonialism. Post-colonialism, actually, you should know, is an umbrella term. And why I spoke about imperialism and colonialism is to just speak about the background that led to this movement, post-colonialism. It is an umbrella term, and its connotations kind of range from a chronological meaning, you know the chronological meaning, post-colonialism, after colonialism, to the current levels of cultural discourse. We are actually living in a world of post-colonialism. And the first use of the term is very ambivalent and ambiguous, but Spivak has used it. I don't say that she is the first one to use it, but she has used in a collection of interviews titled The Post-Colonial Critic. She has used the term post-colonial in 1990 in a series of interviews which is titled The Post-Colonial Critic. And it means the cultural interactions and the effects of imperialism on the colonized society. Then it is not just the imperial effect, it is also the political, linguistic, and cultural experiences of societies that were former European colonies. So how they fare, the kind of language that we speak, the kind of literature that we produce, the kind of administration that we have, and the economic structure that we have, everything is post-colonial. And as you would know, you do not need any introduction in saying that it covers a vast area of applications. It has a lot of connotations, and it is broad in outlook. Because, you know, why I say post-colonialism is such a broad term is because India is a post-colonial country, so is America. If you talk about, say, the post-colonial aspect of it, because it is America developed out of settler colonialism. But see how different they are. Say, say West Indies is post-colonial in a way. India is post-colonial, definitely. And America, can we call it post-colonial? So these are the debates that we should have in our mind when we use this term. So now let me just tell you a comment by Stephen Sleman. He actually speaks about post-colonial in these ways. He says, it has been used as a way of ordering a critique of totalizing forms of Western historicism. It is a critique of totalizing forms of Western historicism. Then it is a portmanteau term for retooled notions of class. It is a subset of both post-structuralism and post-modernism. And it is a condition of nativist longing in post-independence national grouping. Then, yes, it is a cultural marker for non-residency. That is another term that he uses. Cultural marker for non-residency for a third world intellectual cadre. For that matter, I would tell you, my dear friends, I have even objections to, as a post-colonial, to the use of third world. Who decides who the first and second world are? Again. Then, as the inevitable underside of fractured, inevitable underside of fractured and ambivalent disposition of colonialist power, and as an oppositional form of post-colonial reading practice. So these are things that that Stephen Sleman comments on post-colonialism. Then it presents the other side of colonialist practice and represents the voice of the other from a racial point of view. So as you would all know, post-colonial is a state of being politically independent after the sway of colonialism. So once colonial load has been lifted, whatever the situation of being politically independent. So mark the word politically independent, even it has its problematic associated with it. And it is the state of being historically, materially, in actual living conditions of newly independent nations and the cultural impact of third world. And it addresses the strategies of resistance and of negotiation too. So the strategies of resistance and negotiations also are addressed by the term post-colonialism. Now, there is another, I think you might have all heard about the name of the critic, you know, Ashcroft, Griffith, and Tiffin. So, and then Helen Gilbert. These are all some critics on post-colonialism. Okay. So, and this comment by Gilbert, Helen Gilbert, she speaks on the term post-colonial like this. The term indicates a degree of agency for a program of resistance against cultural domination. So resistance is there, and not only resistance, but a degree of agency. Then signals the existence of a particular historical legacy. The next idea is, it is the culture's transition to the modern nation state. It is a form of co-option into Western cultural economies. And post-colonial has become a convenient term actually to describe any kind of resistance, particularly against class, race, or gender oppression. So there is something general associated with it. And it is a narrative strategy, it is a representational strategy, and a political strategy of once formerly colonized Asian African nations. So, dear friends, now, so this is what is post-colonialism. I have almost covered what post-colonialism is. It is a moment, it is a say a movement of resistance, of questioning the hegemony, of the writing practice, reading practice. It addresses economic issues, it addresses impact. Now we will have to know what all these things are. I will give you the examples how it is done. But before that, there is one problem that generally we find is people who write about post-colonialism with hyphen, without hyphen. Sometimes people write post-colonialism without the hyphen in between. Otherwise, after post, there is a hyphen. Now, one is not the same. Sometimes an effort, people write it without actually differentiating the two, but there is a huge difference between the two. Post-colonialism without hyphen and post-colonialism with hyphen. Post-colonialism with hyphen is a reductive term in the sense that it actually speaks about the post-colonial aspect of it. So it looks at the cultural state of a particular country or a group of people or anything after the impact of colonialism, once the load of colonialism has been lifted. But the hyphenated word signifies a chronological elements of colonialism, post-colonialism, as something that comes after colonialism. Whereas this post-colonialism as a word together without hyphen is more inclusive, and it is a comprehensive movement, and it has within its purview big colonialist implications and the post-colonial sensibility. So I think you can say that, because this is comprehensive, because this takes into account the colonial legacy. If you can see, legacy is again something that, that is given to you. You can take or not take if you want it, if you don't want it. So the colonialist implications and the post-colonial sensibility are together compressed in this huge term called post-colonialism without hyphen. So it's very important that you know what you speak about. So post-colonialism with hyphen is reductive. Post-colonialism without hyphen is comprehensive, but it includes in its purview as teacher had introduced the topic, she said it's about the past and the future and the present. So it is comprehensive. So it theorizes colonialism too as something that has a significant effect on post-colonialism. So I would say it is more, it is comprehensive, it is more significant. And as we would know, post-colonialism is an umbrella term. It is wider in significance, and it is both a theory and a practice. And now, what are the practical aspects of it? So, and I believe one thing that we should what we should remember about post-colonialism is that it is something where it is very difficult to differentiate between the theory and practice. Some people, some critics, even I've been reading Pramod Nayar and and all these other theorists. Majority of them speak about post-colonialism. Then we have Jane, Hiddleston. All of them speak about post-colonialism as the theory, whereas the theory that theorizes about post-coloniality, which is a state of being a post-colonial. Post-coloniality is the state or the existence of a post-colonial, and the existence and the variety of it, the multitudinal aspects of it has been theorized by the term post-colonialism. Post-colonialism as a word is more applicable as a theory. That is what so many scholars have this position. And post-coloniality is a condition, the situation of being a post-colonial. And the post-coloniality also addresses the I would say not subservience. Post-coloniality as a term talks about the colonial too in its purview. The colonialism and its other, that is post-coloniality. Whereas post-colonialism as a theory, post-colonialism as a theory and a movement is a resistance movement, and it is a challenge of the structures of domination, of capitalism, of colonialism, of imperialism, and everything, I would say. And you can include all the rebellions or the national movements, all the independent revolutions that have taken for independence, for in the world against the Euro dynamics of the world or the capital dynamics of the world, etc. And it also is a practical application against the dominance of Western hegemonic practices, the rule of the whites. Even, when you struggle against the color, there are a lot of ads which the young ones would notice how the ads have changed. But instead of fair and lovely, they have moved into something else, glow and lovely. So you can have so all these things, I would say, they all come under post-colonialism, because such changes in perceptions, in images, will not happen in the world without movements, without people problematizing it. So naturally, post-colonialism addresses all the questions against cultural hegemony, against the rule of the whites, this dominance of color. You can see the wedding ads, ഇപ്പോൾ വെളുത്ത് സുന്ദരിയായ എന്നുള്ള സാധനങ്ങൾ തരം terms you still see in ads in Kerala, in marriage. How velup, which is fairness, which is not an attribute of Indian say races generally, is still considered as an attribute because of the internal colonizations. Then the dominance of English as a powerful tongue, the emergence of native nationalist governments and the resistance to its neo-colonial successors, the resistance against the politics of color, of race, the voice of native languages and the emergence of native writers, political independence. These are all the practical applications of post-colonialism. And in its theory, as I said earlier, it questions dominance, resistance. It questions dominance and addresses resistance. It questions hegemony, and it deals with issues of writing back to the center. And it talks about subalternity. We have heard about it. And it also talks about challenges orthodox notions of canonic literature that has kept the native in subservience. And it also sets right the assumptions in colonial texts, rewriting, rereading. So I'm slowly coming to post-colonial writing. And so along with all the national movements where we have leaders like Gandhi, Nehru, Julius Nyerere, Amilcar Cabral, then we have Nelson Mandela. All of them are fighting. Even lots of fights are still going on, struggles are still going on all over the world against colonialist dominations. I will come to that later, even in post-colonial situations. So along with all the struggles of against domination, political domination and economic domination, the resistance movements that are mounted through the text, challenging notions of canonic text, that actually is what counter-discursive also. That they are also counter-discursive. And even the anti-slavery movement, apartheid movements, these are all actually part of post-colonial movements. And now you have also heard about how, struggles against the corporates like Coca-Cola, which was mounted by a very puny woman from in India. That was a huge post-colonial struggle. So that is why I said the purview is varied. The purview is so vast, and you cannot actually put it down to one single method, one single idea, etc. So it is the mind that should be decolonized of you and me. Now, let me just move into another method of post-colonial resistance, which is post-colonial writing. And there are a lot of theoreticians of post-colonialism. You have all heard about them. I'm not saying something new, but I am trying to just summarize all these heads in one single point. So we have, we can also talk about, Marx, Gramsci, and Althusser, all of them, because their notions of ideology, their notions with regard to ideology, hegemony, etc., are central to the post-colonial denunciation of colonial power. So I begin from them, and then I just talk about Amy Césaire, or whatever, and the idea of negritude that they spoke about. And what is negritude? Negritude is a politicized cultural identity of the Black people, a kind of horizontal relationship with one another, something like a Malayali. When you say you have an innate relationship, another person from Kerala, and we understand that there'll be some kind of cultural characteristics that bind us all together in spite of the micro differences. Like that, negritude is that warm, say, warm humanhood that unite all the Blacks together. And actually, it is a very positive program because Leopold Senghor, they've all, and they've many others, they've turned it into a kind of political program by essentializing the native identity. And it's a kind of, as I told earlier, it's a kind of horizontal relationship with all the kinsmen, all these Blacks together. And it also celebrates, so negritude as a concept celebrates the revolutionary power of Black poetry, and there is a rejuvenation of the native land also. So negritude was a very powerful concept. It was put forth by Amy Césaire. And now I'm just coming to another theorist who have all heard about him. His name is Frantz Fanon. Major text that he has written is, one is The Wretched of the Earth, the second is Black Skin and White Mass. Wretched of the Earth was written in, say, 1967. And, he has actually one thing that made me, I've read a portion in his work, and he says, when he had grown up in Martinique, in West Indies, and it was a French colony. So he thought, okay, I am a Frenchman, because he never felt any differences when he was growing up. Later, as he was walking through the street, he speaks an autobiographical account in which a small child calls out to its mother, saying, "Mama, see the Negro, I am frightened." And he says, it is, he was expecting to be treated as a French man and had a French education and is a doctor actually. And he said during the years of growing up, it was in some of in his teenage when he was growing up, and he says, that was a moment I suffered an amputation, an excision, a hemorrhage that spluttered my whole body with black blood. That's what he says. And he says, that is the moment then I realized that black is black and white is white. And he says, the white man is sealed in his whiteness, the black man in his blackness. So there is no meeting. That cannot make the two meet, black and white as stark binary opposites. Fanon also, has spoken about, I would say, negritude in a way in which he says that a call for an encounter, why not make an attempt to touch the other? He wants for that bossy of humanity. And Fanon actually concentrated on the dehumanization of, we have all heard about his various idea that he has spoken about. And he speaks about how the natives were dehumanized by the colonialism, and he argues for the humanism to prevail. And he spoke about mimicry, the colonized mimicking the action of the violence of the colonizer, the actions of the colonizer. And he says, the black man mirrors the white image of blackness through white masks that belie his native culture. And he says that he was a psychologist, like he was a psychiatrist, and he concentrated on the psychic effect of, say, colonialism. And he said that in Black Skin and White Mask, he explores the psychic alienation of the black man and his sense of splitting from himself. He says that there is a split identity which the black man suffers because his entire self is constructed by the white man. The white man's image of the self, of the black, is what the black carries within his psyche. And he says, he affirms, on the one hand, he affirms the black man's Negro identity. On the other hand, he feels that it is a fractured self that is there. And he says, the colonial master claims psychic superiority over the savage native, which in turn, the native also believes that, okay, I am savage, and weaves it into his psyche and occupies a subordinate stance. The native perpetuates the violence that he inherits from his master. So that is why Fanon says colonialism itself is a violent process, and the violence that the colonizer handed over to the colonized is perpetuated among the colonized, the natives. That is why a post-colonial nation, you go to Africa, you think about India, you think about any post-colonial nation, which is torn by internal conflict, because there is a kind of repressive violence within. The wretchedness is the native stance. And he said that the native is a product of colonialism. And colonialism projects itself as the origin of everything. And national consciousness. So Fanon says, okay, there will be national consciousness which rises as a project against the narrative of colonialism. But he says, and when you're fighting a colonizer, there will be this kind of solidarity because you have a common enemy. But once decolonization happens, once it is national government, he says the national middle class would cause more trouble. We don't have to go anywhere for corroborating this statement. And he says, there is an internal splitting that the native suffers. Now, the Fanon's idea of mimicry, Fanon's idea of colonial violence, etc. We have his books being prescribed for us. I'm just giving, what shaped him. That's all. Now let me move to another theorist whom we have all heard, the one who is familiar to us through Orientalism. Orientalism was published in 1978. And it is actually, Said looks at this term Orientalism in three ways. It is a way of coming to terms with the Orient. It is a study that is concentrated on the Orient. That is the one thing. Second is, and which has a special place in European experience. Then it is a style of thought based on the ontological and epistemological distinction made between the Orient and the Occident. It is a style of thought and based on the ontological and epistemological distinction made between the Orient and the Occident. And then, thirdly, it is a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. So there is a production of ideas, knowledge, and opinions about the Orient. It is done with the consent of the native, you know. So this Orientalism is generally done with the consent of the native. So there is this willing native, you know, and native accepts this colonial projections and stereotype images, and it justifies the Western dominance and the rule of the Western dominance as the protector of things. So Orientalism and Occidentalism, and in contrast to that, we have this idea of Occident. And Said asserts that Orientalism is not an airy European fantasy about the Orient, but a created body of practice in which, for many generations, there has been a considerable material investment. And he says the Orientalist view of the Orient acquire hegemony and serve to prop up myths of European superiority that are largely accepted by the society in which they are propagated. So that is the idea of Said's idea of Orientalism. Orientalism, it is because of this Oriental myth that, you know, I think we're all familiar with how Orientalism features in Hollywood movies. How our land is a land of snake charmers and, you know, dancing bells through the streets, and how there is poverty sometimes, how there are harems and nawabs and things like that. And when they come to actually to India, they may not find any of these things there. I remember having seen a say James Bond movie where I don't know, some of you may remember the James Bond movie where you land in India, the James Bond, you know, in search of some detective experience, he comes to India, and the moment he walks through some streets, you know, typically Indian street, and you have a snake charmer dancing women in lehengas and all, and how rarely we find such mysterious images on in an Indian say street. So that is the kind of Oriental idea that we have. And Said, but he says that you should have a contrapuntal perspective. Contrapuntal perspective is a disputational reading practice, allowing space for marginal and contradictory narratives. So you need to see through these kind of strategies and make contrapuntal reading. You have to dispute. You have to stand on your legs and argue. You have to see. It is, you know, Orientalism is such a charming kind of an idea where you are suddenly made to look like mysterious and magical. So let us shun this illusion of magic. That is what he says. Now, from Said and Cultural Imperialism is another book that we have familiar with, which is written in 1993. Now, just let me move on to Gayatri Spivak and this idea of subalternity. Actually, it is founded by that is Subaltern Studies is an annual publication which was started publishing in 1982, and it was founded by Ranjit Guha, and it is a collection of historiographic essays, and we have contributions in it from Deepesh Chakravarti, Ashish Nandi, etc. And here the journal actually spoke about my ideas. Subaltern is based basically a historiographic perspective. In this historiographic perspective, what happens is that, so Janajit Guha and those who are writing in it, they kind of argue that, usually we have the perspective either from colonialist perspective or from national elite. The marginal, the repressed, the voiceless, the peasants in Indian society remain repressed, remain voiceless. And we have seen it during the time of COVID, how people walked millions of miles, I would say kilometers and kilometers, to reach their destinations, while flights were being chartered from across the world for people to be brought to India. I'm not criticizing, but that it also shows that there is an ordinary masses. The voice of the ordinary masses are still unheard of. And they would die unknelled, uncoffined, etc. if you speak about such things. So that was the idea of subaltern studies. And they believe this subaltern studies collective, Spivak was part of it. She had a subaltern reading of things, and they believed that the colonial elitist form of history presents Indian nationalism as the sum of activities and ideas by which the Indian hegemonic class responded to the colonial establishment. Bourgeois elitist version defines Indian nationalism as an idealist venture. This is a quote from Ranajit Guha. Idealist venture in which the indigenous elite led the people from subjugation to freedom. Indigenous elite leading the people from subjugation to freedom. And so we find that one group, the marginalized remain marginalized forever. And here the disenfranchised peasantry are exploited by the colonist and deprived of a voice to express. Actually, subaltern is a term that is taken from Gramsci. I need not tell you this. It means of inferior rank. And now to Spivak. Spivak is known to us as the great translator of grammatology, the Derridian text. And actually, can the subaltern speak by, say, I have actually read her essay in which she reads 3 colonial texts, and proves the idea of 3, the critique of imperialism or colonialism. And in Can the Subaltern Speak, she speaks about the homogenization of post-colonial culture. She says that it is not, you should not actually consider post-coloniality, post-colonialism as one homogeneous entity where all of us live very happily. One from Mumbai, one from Kenya, it is not so unproblematic as it sounds. It has its own implications. It has terrible nuances. That's what she says. And Spivak actually used deconstruction for post-colonial theorizing. And this idea, of the subaltern has this idea that the marginalized cannot speak for himself or herself, as the very structure of colonialism prevents the speaking. So the intellectual project must try to make visible the position of the marginalized, and the subaltern must be represented. Spivak argues that actually in Third World, some post-colonial studies retain the distinction between the center and the margin. So there is an institution of marginality even in a post-colonial world. That is what she argues. So subaltern, the disenfranchised, remains in their position of ignorance, in their voicelessness forever, even in a post-colonial state. That is what she argues. Now, let me just move to another person, that is Said. So Said does not believe that. So we have seen, so not Said, I'm moving to Homi Bhabha, and Said had already spoken about this clean distinction between fixture and stability, like Orient as one division, Occident as another division, neatly packed into blocks. But Bhabha says no. Colonial discourse is as ambivalent as anything else, and it cannot be actually divided into this kind of fixture and stability. The psychic relation between the colonizer and the colonized move between, say, fear and desire for the other. So there is ambivalence, the relations are ambiguous, and there is a third space in between. Actually, the third space is not an identifiable alternative position to those of colonizer or the colonized. It is a gap between the subject of proposition and that of enunciation. It's a space of slippage, a space of cultural ambivalence and productivity, because it is a production of meaning there. So there is, you cannot actually divide colonial discourse into neat packed blocks, you know. The psychic relation between the colonizer and the colonized move between fear and desire for the other. That's what he said, of negotiation and of transaction. And the colonial identity is maintained through the creation of stereotype. It's one major contribution by her, the idea of stereotype. Then we have the idea of the concept of mimicry, and the native mimicking the forms and habits of colonial master intended as colonial copies. But there is something, you know, actually, the when the Baba mentions that, you know, when stereotypes are created, when the through the mimicry, the concept of mimicry, when the native mimics the ideas, the language, etc. of the colonizer and try to imitate them, it is, they are intended as colonial copies. But in practice, it returns the colonial gaze, which is an act of resistance. You can very well see this in a very beautiful play, which is The Tempest. I do not call it beautiful because Shakespeare has penned it beautifully. I call it beautiful because Caliban is an example of what Baba intended as colonial mimicry. So the colonial master shaped him to speak his language, to be at least half civilized as the so-called colonial is. But what happens to him? He uses the same language to spit at the face of the master who shaped him. So the gaze is returned equally, if not more strongly. So that is the idea. And the idea of stereotype, idea of mimicry, these are all ambivalent. It actually all projects, it all reflects the ambivalence of colonial discourse. You cannot actually neatly pack things into groups, in a colonial discourse. And there is another beautiful idea which he speaks about, that is the idea of idea of hybridity also is included in what his idea, what he speaks about, the idea about a hybridity by Baba. Baba speaks about hybridity also. So now, actually, it is part of now hybridity. How is hybridity coming up? As part of the civilizing mission, Europeans introduced Western thinking and languages. The result is what Homi Bhabha theorized as the hybrid colonized native. Because Macaulay's Minute of 1835, what does it say? He says, we have to create Europeanized natives as a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinion, in morals, and in intellect. And so we have a crossbreeding of people who are hybrid, which are neither the colonial nor the colonized. So actually, hybridity is a term from zoology, and it is a crossbreeding of two species by grafting or cross-pollination to form a new hybrid species. That is the meaning. And Baba contends that all cultural statements and systems are constructed in a space that he calls the third space of enunciation. I mentioned what is third space earlier, which is neither colonizer space nor the colonized space. And the hybridity is the idea in which the same and the not the same. It is a mixture, neither one nor the other. That is the idea of hybridity. And it is a metonymy of presence in the sense that it is ambivalent, it is a metonymy of presence, and it causes anxiety of influence on the colonizers. Hybrid colonized native is half native and half westernized. So these are the ideas that he speaks about. And now that actually brings me to the idea of, from the idea of various theoreticians. There are a lot of them, and I'm not going to speak on all. I've just introduced, I know it is not introduced, but I've just spoken about some people who are known to you. Now, let me move to this idea of post-colonial writing. Post-colonial writing actually seeks to analyze how non-European lives and its expressions have been marginalized in colonial writings. And it is a literature of resistance, of challenge, and of revision, as I told earlier. And it rewrites the masterpieces of the past, exposing the racial prejudice within. Then it also intends to concentrate on the native ideologies and the celebration of native history. So it theorizes, it exposes the subtle nuances of colonial domination. Then it also exposes the silencing and marginalization of the post-colonial voice. So these are all things that we see in post-colonial writing. And I began with the term counter discourse, and I said that it is a term that was used by Turdiman, Richard Turdiman, which has been used by Tiffin, etc., in their texts to refer to, say, symbolic resistance. And counter discourse is generally understood or has been primarily done through challenges posed to particular texts and to imperial ideologies that are inculcated through the text. For an example, I would tell you, it is about, we've all heard about Jean Rhys and her book White Sargasso Sea. We have this beautiful Jane Eyre, the governess, and her Rochester and the Thornfield Hall, all spoken about in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. And as youngsters, I don't know about today's youngsters, but as a youngster, I read it with enthusiasm, and so will be so many who have read it without saying, say, Jean Rhys' book. Jean Rhys is a Dominican, is a West Indian writer, and her book is titled White Sargasso Sea. And where, after reading White Sargasso Sea, which was later on spoken about as the intertext of Jane Eyre, I suddenly found the equations reversing. In Jane Eyre, we were so angry. As a teenager, I was so angry with the mad woman at the attic, who was imprisoned in the attic, who could spoil the beauty of Jane's life by coming in between and shrieking in between and setting fire to the patriarchal hall. But on reading White Sargasso Sea, it was a new world that was open in front of me. It questioned the structures of patriarchy that was so much dominant in Thornfield Hall. It exposed the double-sidedness of this man, Rochester, and more importantly, it lets out the narrative of Antoinette Cosway, whose name was taken off in Bertha Mason. And mind you, my dear friends, in White Sargasso Sea, what happens is that the Rochester-styled character does not have a name. So if Rochester took her name in the parent text and changed to a typically English name, Antoinette Cosway to Bertha Mason, here Rochester figure does not even have a name because it is Antoinette's narrative. So that is the power that post-colonial countertexts offer to the colonized, to encase the, I wouldn't use the term encase, to explore the possibility of the native. And it is specific, and it is through the subversion of canonical text that this is done. Another term which I have found in Richard J. Lane for this kind of narrative is embroiling narrative. Embroiling narrative is something that offers radical critique and a violent rejection of destruction at the same time. So embroiling narrative is a term that has 2 or 3 meanings put into it. It is an embroiling narrative would radically critique a previous canonical text and would give a violent rejection and destruction of the the canonical colonialist text. So Tiffin, Helen Tiffin says, counter-discourse is a strategy in which the post-colonial writer takes up a character or characters or the basic assumptions of a canonical text, subverting the text for post-colonial purposes. And that is exactly what we have in Jane Eyre. We have it in Robinson Crusoe being criticized by J.M. Coetzee in Poe, and Lamming has done it beautifully with Water with Berries. Tempest is being taken for a ride in water with berries. You can all read it and find it for yourself. Then we have Gone with the Wind, that beautiful Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind being put in her place by Seeley in Wind Done Gone. So these are all revisions, counter-discursive revisions, which you can see for yourself. And early post-colonial writing generally concentrated on the narratives of nationalism, decolonization, aboriginal and tribal narrative. You can see, what we have in Kantapura and all. Suddenly, we are all so happy about the nation that has come into being, how it is our own mother, our own, the Europeans say patrie or fatherland. For us, it is motherland. So whatever it is. So a discourse on the nature of post-colonial identity and how lucky that we have been, able to beat the foreigner and to send away the enemy and be happy and all. So that is one beautiful idea of colonization, decolonization that we have in the early nationalist narratives. But later, slowly we would find that in Midnight Children, Mimic Men, Buddha of Suburbia, you have seen Hanif Qureshi's work, etc., we would see the disillusionment of post-colonial nations and the disillusionment of the idea of nation, etc., figure into it also. Now, I will just skim through certain major themes also in and how post-colonial writing brings into bear certain ideas. One is violence. We have seen Fanon speaking about colonial violence and how there is the individual, how the psyche of the native is fractured. So violence is a major theme in post-colonial narratives. You've all read Waiting for the Barbarians. You've all read several works by Chinua Achebe or Ngugi wa Thiong'o or Rushdie or anyone, and you would find how violence is a dominant theme. So decolonization itself is a violent process, and whatever the native has mimicked from the image of the colonizer goes on to affect the life of the within a post-colonial idea too. And so the violence is multifold and many-sided. It is a social, it is cultural, epistemic, and linguistic, economic, and political. So if you take Jean Reyes, I'm giving this example because it's a text that is close to my heart because I have done my there. So you would find that Antoinette is a fractured individual, caught between the conflicts of selfhood because she's a Creole. Creole is a mixture, that hybrid native, which is neither colonial nor native, and who are actually, they are termed as cockroaches, white cockroaches. The colonial masters or the Europeans in the community do not consider them as part of them, and the natives consider them as, cockroaches. They consider them as, say, the niggers. So this is the kind of land, fractured self that we have in. So the violence is not just external, it is internal too. The native suffers the violence of the colonial master. The one in between, the hybrid, also suffers the same. Hybrid in the sense, the Creole. And the colonial master has to suffer the mirroring of violence in the native, because we find that in Genres, the colonial masters, Bangla is put into Culibri, their estate is put into fire by the natives once Emancipation Proclamation is done. So you can see in so many, post-colonial narrative, and it is integral. The idea of violence is integral to post-colonial narrative, and it is an epistemic violence. Another level, I feel that the violence that is on the eraser of history and memory of a nation. A colonial power dawns on us, actually lands on us, erases us completely and goes off, leaving us nowhere. Shashi Tharoor has spoken about how the British Empire was founded on India, the entire Indian loop, and how it left us later. So there is a total level of epistemic violence in the sense that the entire history is muddled, and what we suffer now, probably if there are internal conflicts and communal violence, is precisely because the seeds have already been sown. And I will come to the minute aspect of it a little later, because I would say that another thing, as post-colonial, there are things that we should think about. So the next term is, of course, the idea of nation and narration, which we have seen. A nation as the result of narrations. So we have discourse of nationalism in this work called Anandamad, and anti-colonial movements, etc., which would consider nation as a homogeneous entity. And nationalist project, which requires a common enemy, and suddenly all of us are happy attacking the and there is this assertion of pride. So, and according to Fanon, he says the native intellectuals should be engaged in the search for the truth of the nation, which are in the first place its reality. And he says he has to go on until he has seen the seeping port out of which emerges the learning of the future. So nation is, again, constructing the nation, reconstructing the nation is also a national, nation is also a post-colonial project, and that is generally done through narrations, because Benedict Anderson speaks about imagined community. If we are one India, it is because we imagine ourselves as a community. And that is all done through the narration of Bharat Mata, of Vande Mataram, and of the various I think many of us have this memory of all those mile surmera tumara to sur bane hamara. It is because when there is a weakening of the national consciousness, these things, these strategies, post-colonial, these strategies of building the nation, the narrations would again reinforce us into this fold of the nation. And the idea of standing up for national anthem, which we had been doing for some time, also, I would say, is such an idea of strengthening this idea of nation. And Rushdie again speaks about imaginary homeland. A home is in memory, rather. A home is sometimes in memory. And when we're talking about narrations, which actually make up the nation, I have something else also to speak about, which is how sometimes our memory and history and everything, we can never ever go back to a pre-colonial era per se. So there is this whole idea of purity in those days is kind of impossible. And because we look at the colonizer as one evil force that landed on the land and destroyed everything that is beautiful in it and then left us. If we go back to the pre-colonial era, we would feel that the memory is not so, retrieving memories can sometimes bring out certain ghosts of the past which had seen worse injustice, I would say. This is for you to just think about. This is one thing which I have always thought about, let memories lie. It is like, as what Foucault said, origins can be, sometimes if you look for earthsprung or origins, it can be sometimes very depressing. So we have, sometimes I feel that because there has been a colonial in between our past and the present, we can probably put all the blame on the colonial. And Partha Chatterjee, you've heard about him, he speaks about this idea of nationhood as a discourse of difference, rather. And nation as a construction, as something that draws on paper, enforced through material forces. So these are all ideas where you speak about the nation as something that is constructed. Another very important aspect of post-colonial writing, post-colonialism, is language. Language is a central question in post-colonial studies. And during colonization, the colonizers, imposed their language, encouraged the dominance of their native language onto the people they colonized. And in response to the systematic imposition, people responded differently. And if you actually speak about how writers responded to it, we can talk about two writers. One is, of course, Ngugi wa Thiong'o. He's a Gikuyu writer from Kenya, and he began a successful career. He actually began writing in English. Later on, he turned to his native language, and he's written this beautiful work called Decolonizing the Mind. And he says that language is not something that with which you describe the world. Language is something by which we understand. I am a Malayali because I speak Malayalam. A person who does not speak Malayalam may not will be a little ambivalent about himself as Malayali. And according to, say, Thiong'o, he says, English in Africa is like a cultural bomb, and which continues a process of erasing memories of pre-colonial cultures. English has this habit of, erasing the entire memory. That is what he says. And writing in Gikuyu, he is hearkening, he's listening back to his Gikuyu tradition. It's a way of going back, reliving, reinventing your own cultures. And he says, I am not concerned with universality of things. I am concerned with individuality, with my own culture. But on the other side of language, we have, I would say, Rushdie, who it is a trip through the entire nations, tackle the history of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Great Britain, etc. And he says, working in new Englishes is a therapeutic act of resistance. That is what he says. So I think English, we have seen how the colonizers tried to teach the language of English to the natives, trying to civilize them, to make them, to make them civilized, to create English people in spirit at least. But how various people, various writers, various natives responded to it differently. We have seen so many Calibans emerging, using it powerfully to turn the colonial gaze upon themselves, to reverse the gaze. And he says, in the essay Imaginary Homelands, he explains that far from something that can be ignored or disposed of, English language is a place where writers can and must work out problems that confront emerging and recently independent, independent colonies. And in Helen, Ashcroft, Griffith, and Tiffin, they actually speak about two-part process through which English is actually taken into the native community. One is through abrogation. The second is accommodation. And abrogation is the refusal of the categories of imperial culture, its aesthetics, its illusory standard of normative or correct usage, etc., and its assumption of a traditional and fixed meaning inscribed in the word. So it is a total negation of whatever the colonials expect from their language. Appropriation is by which accommodation or appropriation is the process by which the language is made to bear the burden of one's own cultural experience. So abrogation and appropriation or accommodation. This is a term that by which language is accommodated, language is made part of a native community. We can very well see it in genres again, you know. There is this character, this black woman, this Obeya woman in genres White Sargasso. Her name is Christophine. You know, some critics say that she is the mark of counter discourse, not Antoinette Cosway in White Sargasso Sea. Christophine says that I'm not using the master's language, his language as they want it. I'll speak it my way. And she goes on disturbing the entire structure, using it in her style. You know, when we actually misrepresent, mispronounce English, I'm sure there will be people who are happy that we are destroying the kind of royal structures which they, which the Britishers, which the Europeans probably planned. And we have people like Shashi Tharoor, you know, they are writing with a move to indigenous English to make it usable for us too. And we have Brathwaite. Brathwaite speaks about a nation language which is heavily influenced by African folk culture. So these are all questions regarding language. How language is a tool of colonization, probably turned against the colonizer. How it is no more English, it is Englishes. So we don't have a capital E, instead we have a lot of small e's, you know, with regard to language. And I remember here the quote made by Kamala Das. She says, I speak 3 languages, write in 2 and dream in 1. Again, another beautiful language quote. Derek Walcott, we have all taught the poem from which it is taken, which is divided to the vein, divided to the vein, how to choose between these Africa and the English tongue I love. So these are all various dilemma which a post-colonial must face in such a scenario. I'll just read a little poem also on the loss of a language by Rita Jo. I lost my talk, the talk you took away when I was a little girl at Suba Na Kadi school. So gently I offer my hand and ask, let me find my talk so I can teach you about me. Now let me just move on to history and memory, which are also, I have just mentioned it in passing earlier, because it is because, you know, in White Sargasso Sea and all, you would say that almost all these narrations are memories of, they are all historiography, an alternate historiography, and they're all on, I think it was Adrian Rich who has written this poem, On Diving into the Wreck. So on diving into the wreck, you come out with a lot of memories, memories of fractured selves who were actually caught under this load of colonialism, a lot of identities that is shattered, a lot of selves that were lost. So I would say memory is an integral part of memory writing, you know, writing, I would say reinventing memory, because it is through reinventing memory that reinventing history is done in post-colonial writing. So in Jean Rey's White Sargasso Sea, she remembers all the time that she spent in her native Jamaica, in her native West Indies, you know, the green land and the blue sea, and, you know, how happy she was, if not troubled. You know, there were she was had suffered her troubles there, but it was far better than the alien structure, the alien land, the cold English climate, and the cold English behavior where she is placed. So we can see how memories can be disturbing, how memories can be, memory of a pre-colonial space, a pre-colonial utopia. But on closer analysis, we should find that every utopia has its chinks, you know, its gaps, very clear gaps. Derek Walcott makes this comment that the sea is history. And Wilson Harris makes this idea of infinite rehearsal, which is constant rereading of cultural texts to revive, to retake constant rereading of cultural texts to revive, to reclaim memory. To reclaiming memory is reclaiming history, and history of the persons who have been written out of discourses because the colonial and the capitalist uh, because of the colonialist capitalist complicity that had actually destroyed a lot of cultural structures. So it is reclaiming the culture, reclaiming native traditions, reclaiming memory, reclaiming history, and it is so there is a rememorialization and rehistorialization, I would say, historicization in post-colonial writing. And that actually bring me to uh, another aspect of it, that is nostalgia. We have seen it earlier, diaspora. Nostalgia for a country of a home is very important in post-colonial writing. And that actually brings us to the idea of the idea of diaspora, displacement of a community into another geographical and cultural region. Diaspora is the effect of migration, immigration, and exile. So I must mention that alienation, exile, these are all deeper questions which are ingrained in post-colonial writing. Actually, I think I have this text. Okay, in White Sargasso, she begins like this, like Jean Rhys begins the narration. It is Antoinette narration like this. They say, when trouble comes, close ranks. So the white people did, but we were not in their ranks. The Jamaican ladies had never approved of my mother. So you would know that this kind of alienation is throughout there in so many of post-colonial writing. Feeling exile in one's own land, if you are in your own land, if you are in a diaspora, if you are a diaspora, exiling, feeling exile for a very different reason. And diasporic writers signify the phenomenon of third world writers in a Western metropolis. So there is this comment made by Roger Bromley. He says that narrative in diasporic writing is both an individual story and a cultural narrative. There are two aspects of diasporic writing, which is exile and homeland. And you have Mina Alexander, fault lines. You can see what I'm trying to tell you is that whether it is Edward Said's Out of Place or Mina Alexander's Writing in Search of a Homeland, there are gaps, which cannot be filled. You are searching for a full you. There is this fractures of identity. There is this identity issues that a post-colonial writer, whether it is diasporic, especially a diasporic writer, suffers. There is this idea of displacement, and diaspora addresses the issue of a temporal move and a spatial movement. What is the temporal move? It is between the past and the present, and probably an unseen future. And what the spatial movement is between an alien land and on homeland, and a homeland which is more in your imaginary than in actual. So we have all these Onam celebrations of US and other people, people settled in other countries doing it better than those who are here. So I think these are all things that we must ponder with regard to post-colonial writing. And I think we have also spoken about colonial mimicry. I think I mentioned how projection of colonial images as superior creates a kind of mimicry. Those themes can be seen in all these post-colonial writings. And there is an identity which creates a kind of identity crisis in the native. And I also mentioned mimicry as a resistance used by Baba. One thing I wanted to mention, or with which probably, and one more topic I will end my discussion. One is Aboriginal writings, Dalit writings, etc., which is a resistance. I considered the Aboriginal writings elsewhere and Dalit writings and Adivasi writings in India or other places as resistance to homogenization, which is imposed by post-colonialism. And these things mainly draw upon oral tradition, are replete with folk tales, images, and this idea of nature also thrives dominantly in, say, in Aboriginal writing, and it also challenges the domination by dominant tribes. Again, for an example, things fall apart. Why is Okonkwo, how does he attract us? Because of his, uh, uh, that, there is that kind of innocent love for the land, where he would die for his motherland, and where you can see that the edifice of patriarchy, edifice of colonialism, how it actually swallows his little hut of native tradition. So what I'm saying is, when you go back to Aboriginal writing, I do not say that things fall apart is Aboriginal writing, but I am suddenly reminded of how this figure of Okonkwo, and Aboriginal writing or Dalit writing is a post-colonial voice which actually looks for its own space in, now let me come to my point, which is post-colonialism, which is probably now turning into a kind of discourse with its own chinks in it, with its own gaps in it, which actually gives rise to a term called post-colonial subalternization, because there should not be subalterns in the post-colonial space, but unfortunately, we would find that there are, because I am reminded of Mahashweta Devi and all her works, how Dopti is dragged through the streets naked by another Indian. All Indians are brothers and sisters. How Duloti the Bountiful, how she dies on an Indian flag on August 15th. And this actually puts into question all our idea of that homogenization of the post-colonial space. How women are raped at every minute, every 15 minutes, a woman is raped in India. If you are an Aboriginal, chances are more. So Aboriginal in the sense, if you are an Adivasi or a Dalit woman, chances are more. So that actually gives this idea of post-colonial subalternization, and there are continuing effects of post-colonialism. Sometimes I feel that we need not just blame colonialism for that. So it is this gives rise to the idea of post-colonial subalternization, gender, the issues of double colonization with regard to in the case of women, then retrieval of women's history, which is again a need of post-colonialism, which is not properly done, patriarchy, fundamentalism, and war going on strongly in a post-colonial nation. It is not just the case of India, take anywhere in the world. The legacy of colonialism, the violence that has been perpetrated has gone deep into the internal colonization of a country, and which gives rise to more and more mimic men in a native land. And and then there is growing visibility of post-colonial writing. And Spivak actually speaks about a very beautiful idea. She says now there is a new Orientalism, because a lot of awards are coming for post-colonial writings. So third world writings are now marketable products now. And and I'll just take one more idea, which is an idea of which is an idea of illusion. It is an idea of illusion. There is an idea of illusion. It's a term by Neil Lazarus, rhetoric of disillusion, not illusion. It is a rhetoric of disillusion. This post-colonialism, Neil Larson says, is a rhetoric of disillusion, and hence it is a discourse which has become probably as where the old imperialism has been replaced by this idea of the empire, which is a diffuse network of power operating beyond the borders of the nation state. And it is the ongoing dominance of foreign economic power over African regeneration. This is actually a term which is used by Kwame Nkrumah, who is the inaugural president of independent Ghana. He says, colonial domination persists in the immediate aftermath of decolonization. He says, the essence of neo-colonialism is that the state which is subject to it is independent and has all the outward wrappings of international sovereignty. In reality, its economic system and that thus its political policy is directed from outside. And Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, he says, colonialism, imperialism has now moved into this idea of the empire, where it is another set of economic powers who rule the world. I am not becoming that negative, but I would say that there is a rhetoric of dissolution. There should be a humanity that engulfs, of a humanity of inclusion in a post-colonial world, where colonialism should remain as a strategy, as a force that should tell us not to be like us. It should open up a world of inclusion, a world of camaraderie, a world of togetherness for us, the person from Attapadi and the person from Ernakulam, to exist on an equal plane, having facilities. And we would know, even in this scenario of COVID, we have seen how pathetic sometimes the situation is, how privilege is always a very positive word. So let me conclude now. So thank you for suffering for more than 1.5 hours, I suppose. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Jyoti ma'am. Ma'am, there are some questions. I invite Jyoti CR as a research scholar to just highlight the questions.
Hi, ma'am. Good morning. Ma'am, am I audible?
Yes, Julsa, you are audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay. So actually, first of all, I have to thank ma'am, because it's like a big shot on post-colonialism. Like, she covered all the areas in a single shot, and I was wondered, like, from stretching from Homike Baba or even Spivak to Gugiwa Thongo. I can't even explain how it is possible, a single stretch, to speak about all phases at a single. So moving on to our questions. The first question, even I have a doubt from the last 2 years. Ma'am, can you again define the difference between this hyphenated post-colonialism and this unhyphenated post-colonialism?
Yeah. I've kept the video off because I was just drinking some water, that's all. So,
That.
okay, it's okay. So, no problem. So, the thing is, post-colonialism without the hyphen, post-colonialism without the hyphen is a more comprehensive term. It includes the colonial past, colonial strategies, and the post-colonial sensitivity, and its implications. It has to begin from the colonizer through decolonizing movements, or the movements that led to decolonization, and then to the end. Okay, whereas with hyphen, it basically concentrates on the chronological aspect of post-colonialism, which is after colonialism. So many scholars, many critics say that post with hyphen post-colonialism with hyphen is more reductive, lesser in scope than post-colonialism without hyphen. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. And the next question is, it's asked by Anupam Debnath. What is post-colonial criticism?
Post-colonial
Criticism.
criticism is again part of post-colonial writing,
Okay.
in which we try to apply the theories of post-colonialism in reading literary works. So when you read, say, Jane Eyre from the point of view of the, not Jane Eyre, from, say, White Sargassum from the point of view of, say, the native, what we do is a post-colonial criticism of the same thing. Post-colonialism is application of post-colonial premises onto a text and read it in a different way from whatever we have been used to. It is actually from the other side, looking at a text from a post-colonial side, applying the policies and the project of post-colonialism into it.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. And the next question is it's asked by Anira.
Yeah.
What is neocolonization?
Neocolonization.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Yes.
Neocolonization is, we have seen what early colonization was, where some foreigner came and settled down and started appropriating your land, etc. But neocolonization is when we have been economically indebted to. We've been made to be economically indebted to a lot of foreign things, where say colonization is through economic means. There is no physical colonizer present in a land, but colonialism is a new way of economic policies that determine a native country. I just read it earlier, where I mean, as I closed it, I said how neo-imperialism or neo-colonialism is a way in which the economic policies that operate in an erstwhile colony, that is in a post-colonial nation, is mainly done from, say, the European nations. The European market determines what we buy and what we don't. How our lifestyle is altered by, say, the European models. Okay. So that's a different way. It doesn't need physical conquest as such or colonization, but it is sometimes far deeper, far more dangerous than the early colonialism.
Ma'am, then can we call neo-colonization as just an offshoot of imperialism? Because imperialism is more a physical force.
Exactly. That's what I said. It is new kind of imperialism, which is more economic in nature. So you're never free from the giant.
Yes.
The apps that we use, the apps, except the, I would say, even this program happens in a Microsoft team, isn't it?
Yes.
So if we have used, we've been using Geo Meet, that would have been probably Indian.
Yes.
But they close it off, our business is finished.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. That's a wonderful example. Okay. So the next question, let me ask, can we call this neo-colonization as a method of homogenization? Homogenization to the culture or the aspect which we are
actually,
is a model of homogenization.
Actually, there is a kind of homogenizing model of neo-colonialism or neo-colonization, as you said it, because it is more economic, more power-centered. As Foucault would say, there is a capital, a power capital. Power is the capital there. Economic powers kind of say controlling lesser weaker nations. Okay, so it comes in a homogenized manner, but the way it affects different nations is different. How it affects Pakistan is different from the way it affects India, I would say. All these methods, how we take into it. If we have methods to combat it, we would be doing it better. If you think about African countries, they are more under this kind of economic dominance than an Asian countries. Even we also have no, I would say we are all also not very free, but still African politics, African economy, African everything is run by European powers from a distance. It is actually controlling through remote control, because it is tied up with capitalism. Medicines,
Okay. So, ma'am,
money,
again,
food, everything, except native things.
Jyotsna, there are some participants who are ready to speak, I think. If they wish, they can just unmute their mic and speak. Dear participants, those who wish to speak can please unmute your mic and ask questions.
Jyotiman, I am Anjana. Thank you very much for that very broad and comprehensive lecture on post-colonialism. You have covered almost all aspects. Thank you for taking the trouble. I know how busy you are, but in spite of that, you devoted so much of time. I'm very grateful to you.
Miss, you had colonized me like anything. I'm a post-colonial.
Oh,
I live the theory, Miss.
I'm sorry. Only colonized, not neo-colonizing. No.
No neo-colonization.
capitalism. Yeah, forcing.
Is there anyone else to ask some questions? If not, we'll wind up the session.
Are there any questions? Please ask participants, or you can type in the chat box if you want.
One of them typed that what is post-colonial criticism? What is post-colonial criticism?
That is exactly what we are doing right now.
Okay.
Reading post-colonialism from a post perspective. I am not blinded by the glory of what post-colonialism is. That is why there have been critics who said it is a rhetoric of disillusion. So that is a kind of post-colonial criticism.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
I think we can wind up. Anjana, ma'am, shall we?
There are no more questions, I think.
No more questions, I think. So we come to an end of the first talk in the second session of the webinar series, Engaging Theory, Past and Future Prospects. Before we call it a day, I wish to thank Dr. Jyotimol P, who enlightened us with her talk on post-colonialism, from counter discourse to discourse, tracing the trajectory of post-colonialism. Ma'am, you have actually opened new doors of thoughts in a familiar area of discourse, and I'm sure that the takeaway which the session provided would truly help in stretching the boundaries of the discourse. Thank you so much, Jyoti ma'am, for accepting our invitation amidst your tight schedule as the vice principal of Basilius College and a writer in the meantime. I wish to extend my gratitude to all the participants who cooperated with us in the success of the first lecture of our webinar series. I extend my gratitude to our head of the department, Dr. Anjana Shankar, who is a pillar of support for all the activities in our department. I also thank Dr. Preeti Nair in her absence, whose guidance helped in smooth conduct of the program. I also thank my colleagues, especially Srimati Sridevi Annas, for her timely assistance. Thank you all. Have a great day. I also thank our research scholars, especially Sneha Jacob and Jyotsna CR, for their assistance, technical assistance. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ma'am,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Ma'am, did you
Thanks a
take a
lot.
screenshot? Did you take a screenshot, Srija?
Yes. So if you all just switch on your camera, we'll have a screenshot so that we can document this.
Ma'am, it was wonderful. I listened to 2 post-colonial lectures. Yesterday, Dr. Dilip Menon's lecture was wonderful, Devara. And today, this. So,
Is all of you please, yes, on your video so that we can take a, yes.
This is not a very familiar thing for many.
please, could you switch on that mic? There is an emblem of the mic on the bar, top bar.
Yes, ma'am. It's done.
So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, all participants.
Bye,
Thank
Miss.
you all of you.
Thank you all the participants.